Imagine you walk into a movie theater in June of 1960. You've seen the posters, they're strange, more like something out of a cheap paperback thriller than a major Hollywood release. The man who made Rear Window and North by Northwest has a new film out, but here's the thing that really throws you. There's a line around the block. And the manager of the theater just told the crowd that no one will be admitted after the film starts. You shuffle inside. The lights go down. You have absolutely no idea what's about to happen to you. What Hitchcock did with Psycho in 1960 wasn't just make a scary movie. He didn't just push the envelope. He took that envelope, shredded it, flushed the pieces, and built something entirely new out of the wreckage. Psycho is the film that cracked classic Hollywood cinema down its spine. The film that made audiences terrified of shower curtains. The film that proved that the protagonist of a story, the woman whose face you've been staring at for 45 minutes, could be killed off halfway through and the whole thing would just keep going in a completely different direction without apology. That's insane. Even now, knowing it's coming, the structural audacity of that choice is kind of breathtaking. But here's what's easy to lose when we talk about Psycho as a cultural institution. When we frame it as the birth of the slasher genre, the grandfather of every horror film that came after, we risk flattening it into a myth, a museum piece, significant cinema, the kind of film people say they love without actually sitting with it. So let's actually sit with it. What 1960 Hollywood looked like. To understand what Psycho did, you have to understand the world it walked into. Hollywood in 1960 was still operating under the shadow of the Production Code, a set of self-censorship rules enforced by the Motion Picture Association since 1934. The code was explicit: no nudity, no profanity, no graphic violence, no lustful kissing, nothing that might suggest crime pays or that moral authority could be undermined. Studios followed it because they had to. The audience of 1960 had never seen a woman killed in the shower. They'd never seen a toilet flushed on screen. They'd never seen 45 minutes of screen time invested in a character who then simply ceased to exist before the story was half over. These weren't just taboos, they were practically axioms of cinematic grammar, things you simply didn't do. Psycho did all of them. And it did them within a film released by Paramount Pictures, a major studio in mainstream American theaters, not in an art house, not in some underground venue, at the Roxy, at the Rivoli, at the local cinema, 2 blocks from your house. The shockwave was cultural, not just cinematic. Hitchcock before Psycho. Let's pause on who Hitchcock was in 1959 when he started developing Psycho, because his trajectory makes the choice to make this film even more fascinating. Alfred Hitchcock was, without question, the most commercially successful and critically recognized director working in Hollywood. He'd spent the 1950s producing some of the most technically exquisite, lavishly produced films of the studio era. Rear Window in 1954, Vertigo in 1958, a film that, although a modest commercial disappointment at the time, is now regularly ranked as the greatest film ever made. North by Northwest in 1959, a slick, expensive thriller starring Cary Grant with a budget of around $4 million. He had a television show. Alfred Hitchcock Presents ran on CBS from 1955 and was enormously popular. He was so famous that his name above the title was itself a marketing tool. Hitchcock's response was completely Hitchcock. He shrugged, told them fine, and decided to finance the film himself, bought out of his own pocket. A man at the absolute peak of his career, self-financing what would look, from the outside, like a step backward. He used the crew from his television show, cheaper, faster, more comfortable working in compact conditions. He shot at Review Studios, the same lot where Alfred Hitchcock Presents was filmed. He brought the budget down to $806,907. For context, that's roughly 1/5 of what North by Northwest cost. The gamble paid off in a way that probably even Hitchcock didn't fully anticipate. But we'll get to the box office in a moment. The method behind the madness. What drove Hitchcock to make Psycho isn't just a story of stubbornness or artistic ambition. There's something almost experimental about it. Hitchcock and his director of photography, John L. Russell, often had 2 cameras running at once, which was standard practice in television production but almost unheard of for theatrical features. It allowed them to move faster, capture performances from multiple angles in a single take, and gave the film an energy and spontaneity that more traditionally short productions often lack. He was making a feature film with the pace and efficiency of a television episode, and somehow it worked. That's how reviews were ready on opening day. Hitchcock refused. No journalist saw Psycho before it opened. No review could soften or shape the audience's experience. You showed up cold. He also issued a personal statement, printed in film programs and displayed in theater lobbies, asking that audiences not reveal the film's secrets to those who hadn't seen it. In an era before social media, this was less about containing spoilers and more about manufacturing mystery. It created a shared conspiracy between Hitchcock and every person who walked out of a screening. You've seen something they haven't, and it's your job to protect it. Then there was the admission policy. No one admitted after the film began. Period. This was unprecedented in mainstream American cinema. Movies in 1960 ran on a continuous loop. You could walk in at any point, watch whatever was on, and stay to catch the beginning when it came back around. Hitchcock killed that practice for his film. If you were late, you waited outside. The effect of this rule was twofold. It became the second highest grossing film of 1960, trailing only Spartacus. Worldwide, it earned approximately 50 million against its 8 6,907 budget. Hitchcock personally walked away with over 15 million, roughly 160 million in today's money, because he'd retained ownership of the film's negative. That's not just a commercial success. That's when police responding to the disappearance of a local hardware store owner named Bernice Warden arrived at the property of a 51-year-old bachelor farmer named Edward Theodore Gein. What they found inside that house and in the shed out back remains among the most disturbing crime scene discoveries in American law enforcement history. Gein himself was soft-spoken at trial, cooperative with investigators, seemingly bewildered by the scope of the horror he'd created. He would later inspire not just Psycho, but also the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Silence of the Lambs. He is, in the most literal sense, the father of the cinematic serial killer. The man who read the case, Robert Bloch, was a 40-year-old Wisconsin-based writer of pulp horror fiction when the Gein story broke. He lived less than 40 miles from Plainfield. He knew the landscape, the culture, the specific Midwestern brand of quiet that Gein's community had worn like a mask over something rotten. And he was professionally fascinated by the psychology of violence, not the spectacle of it, but the interior life of people who commit it. What struck Bloch about the Gein case wasn't the gruesomeness, it was the ordinariness. The novel's Norman Bates was also significantly different from the one we'd come to know on screen. Bloch's Norman was middle-aged, overweight, and wore glasses. Not particularly memorable to look at. Bloch was making a specific point. The monster doesn't look like a monster. He looks like your neighbor. He looks like the guy at the hardware store. He looks, in other words, like Ed Gein. Hitchcock reads 35 pages. Hitchcock's story editor, Peggy Robertson, reportedly identified the novel and brought it to Hitchcock's attention. Hitchcock read just the first 35 pages up to the moment of the novel's first major shock and immediately knew he wanted to adapt it. Bloch himself would later express complicated feelings about that transaction, though he generally acknowledged that Hitchcock's film was the reason his novel endured. To write the screenplay, Hitchcock brought in Joseph Stefano, a relatively young writer who had one produced screenplay to his name. Stefano's contribution to Psycho is substantially undervalued in the film's mythology. It was Stefano who made the crucial structural suggestion that the film opened with Marion Crane rather than Norman Bates. In Bloch's novel, Norman appears much earlier and is given more interiority from the start. Stefano argued that audiences needed to be deeply invested in a character before that character could be taken from them. In their first and only extended scene together, the conversation over sandwiches and stuffed birds in Norman's parlor, you genuinely feel for this young man. His awkwardness, his loneliness, his small, bleak life in that roadside motel. You catch yourself rooting for him just slightly, even as you sense something is deeply wrong. That tension between compassion and dread is Stefano's greatest gift to the film, casting the uncastable. The casting of Psycho involved several decisions that each carry their own fascinating logic. For Marion Crane, Hitchcock initially approached Eva Marie Saint, who had just worked with him on North by Northwest. She wasn't available. He then considered Lana Turner. Eventually, Janet Leigh was cast, and it was a choice that felt to many at the time like mainstream, glamorous Hollywood leading lady casting. That was, of course, entirely deliberate. Dottie Leigh was 32 at the time of filming, beautiful and bankable, with a career that encompassed both serious dramatic work and light comedies. She was exactly the kind of actress audiences expected to see survive a movie. Her face belonged on the poster. Her name belonged above the title. Casting her as Marion Crane meant audiences would spend the first act of the film assuming they were watching her film, and they'd be right up until the moment they weren't. Leigh would later speak extensively about the shower scene and its effect on her real life, most famously acknowledging that she became genuinely reluctant to take showers after filming it, preferring baths instead. Whether this is the whole story or a piece of carefully maintained publicity mythology is impossible to say from the outside. He'd been Oscar nominated for Friendly Persuasion in 1956 and had built a reputation for playing sensitive, conflicted men with complicated inner lives. His physicality was distinctive, tall, angular, with expressive hands and a nervous energy that manifested in small, specific gestures. But here's the thing about casting Perkins that's so exactly right, and that Hitchcock understood intuitively. Anthony Perkins was likable, genuinely, disarmingly likable. His smile was boyish and warm. His discomfort read as shyness rather than menace. When Norman stammers over his words, looks at his shoes, offers Marian a sandwich with the eagerness of someone who hasn't had real company in years, you don't see a killer, you see a lonely kid. Perkins understood this and played it with remarkable precision. He later said in interviews that he made specific choices to avoid playing Norman as creepy or threatening. That any moment Norman seemed dangerous was something the audience projected onto him, not something he consciously performed. The twitches and stutters and nervous laughs were genuine character choices, not horror movie affectations. Technicolor, bigger, bolder, more vivid. The trend was towards spectacle. Hitchcock's decision to shoot Psycho in black and white was not a concession to budget, though it certainly helped with costs. It was a creative choice made with specific intent. He explained it himself in interviews. Color, in his view, would have made certain scenes unwatchable. The blood in the shower sequence, for instance, would have been too visceral, too real, too explicitly gore driven in color. In black and white, it becomes something more abstract, a dark fluid swirling down a drain. It registers as violence without registering as gore. Black and white Psycho exists in a slightly different register, sharper, harsher, more unforgiving, more like a nightmare than a film. Director of photography John L. Russell was brought in specifically because of his television work. He was fast, efficient, and accustomed to the rapid two-camera setups Hitchcock wanted. Russell had not shot a major theatrical feature before Psycho. His work on the film is exceptional. Deep shadows, high contrast, an architectural sense of space that makes the Bates Motel and the house behind it feel like a single, interconnected psychological space. Building the Bates Motel. The Bates Motel and the Victorian house looming above it are perhaps the most recognizable set in American film history. The individual cabin units, the office with its chirping birds and Norman's round, open face behind the desk, the sense that someone once cared about this place but gave up somewhere along the way. It mirrors Norman's own condition. Both he and his property are stranded in a past that won't fully release them. The house is something else entirely. The Victorian Gothic silhouette against the California sky, high gabled roof, narrow windows, a wraparound porch, reads as simultaneously specific and archetypal. It's a real house rendered as a symbol. The house is mother, imposing, elevated, watching. Norman lives in its shadow, literally and figuratively, and the geography of the film always positions the house above the motel, above Norman, above everything. In every shot where both structures appear, you feel the weight of that hierarchy. The final prep shooting on Psycho began in late November 1959 and wrapped in early February 1960, a remarkably fast production by the standards of the time. The compressed schedule was part of the television efficiency Hitchcock had brought to the project, and the tight budget demanded it. Hitchcock rehearsed extensively before cameras rolled, something he'd always done, but which had special significance here given the precision he required from certain sequences. The shower scene alone was planned months in advance. Hitchcock worked with title designer Saul Bass on a detailed storyboard that mapped out virtually every cut in the sequence. Bass would later claim, in a dispute that went unresolved until his death, that he actually directed the shower scene himself. Hitchcock and virtually every other member of the crew who was present disputed this. What's undisputed is that Bass's storyboards were extraordinary, a masterclass in the planning of montage violence that Hitchcock then translated into film with his extraordinary camera crew. Bernard Herrmann came aboard to compose the score after Hitchcock had already tried and abandoned the idea of using no music in the shower scene. He reportedly told Herrmann that sequence would play without accompaniment. Herrmann composed his famous string attack anyway, played it for Hitchcock, and Hitchcock immediately understood that he'd been wrong. The scree of the strings is so bound up in the scene's impact now that it's almost impossible to imagine the sequence without it. Almost. But we'll get there. The film opens not with the Bates Motel, not with Norman, not with a dark house on a hill or a shadow falling across a road. It opens with a city, a real date, a specific time in the afternoon, the banal, documented, administrative texture of ordinary life. The camera drifts, then descends, craning down from the skyline toward one particular building, one particular window, moving closer and closer until it finds a gap in the blinds and slides through, illegally, into someone's private moment. It's a camera move that's almost voyeuristic before the film has said a word. Hitchcock is showing you his hand. This is going to be a film about seeing, about private things observed, about the space between what people show the world and what they hide inside. Inside that room, in the afternoon, are Marion Crane and her boyfriend Sam Loomis. They're conducting an affair. She wants a life. The texture of dissatisfaction. What's remarkable about this opening stretch is how completely it earns its runtime. Nothing exciting happens for the first 20 minutes or so. Marian goes back to work at the real estate office where she's a secretary. Her boss, Mr. Still. Marian notices it. You notice Marian noticing it. Nothing is said. Nothing is done. But the seed is planted with such precision that when Marian later steals it, you realize you already knew she might, even if you couldn't have articulated that knowledge at the time. Mr. Lorry asks Marian to deposit the $40,000 at the bank on her way home. She takes it. She goes home instead. She sits on the bed in her apartment with the cash envelope in front of her, still in her work clothes, and Hitchcock shoots this in a way that gives the scene a dreamlike, liminal quality. She's not frantic, she's not panicked. She seems to be doing something she's already decided on without quite consciously deciding it. The money is there, the opportunity is there. Psycho doesn't do that. What Marian steals isn't really money, it's the idea of a different life. When Cassidy waves those bills around and announces he's buying his daughter happiness with them, Marian is sitting across a desk from a vision of everything she doesn't have: financial ease, a future that's been cleared of obstruction, the ability to simply decide to be happy and then arrange the material conditions to make it so. Sam's debt isn't abstract to Marian. It's the specific, grinding reality that's keeping her life on hold. She's 30 years old, conducting a lunch hour affair in a rented room, and the path forward requires patience and time she doesn't feel she has. Cassidy's money is the shortcut. The $40,000 that could make the debt disappear, make the future arrive early, make the waiting stop. On the road, building dread. From nothing. The middle section of Marian's journey, her drive from Phoenix toward Fairvale, California, where Sam lives, is a masterclass in how to generate anxiety without incident. She drives. That's all she does, technically. She drives. But watch what Hitchcock does with that driving. The first time we see Marian behind the wheel, she's tense but composed. She passes a car dealership and makes an impulsive, deeply stupid decision. She pulls in and trades her car. This is the moment you understand that Marian is not a skilled criminal. She is just a frightened person making bad decisions. A competent thief would have kept her original car for days before switching. She wakes to a state trooper tapping on her window. He's wearing mirrored sunglasses. He looks at her, looks at the car, writes down her plate, says nothing accusatory, just says she should get some sleep in a proper place, not by the side of the road. He's completely polite. He's done nothing wrong, and the scene is almost unbearable to watch. That's because we've transferred our anxiety to Marian so completely by this point that any authoritative presence reads as existential threat. The trooper's mirrored glasses are important. You can't see his eyes. You can't read him. He might know everything. He might know nothing. He says nothing further. He doesn't follow her. And yet by the time she drives off in her new car, your heart is racing as though she just escaped through a second-story window. That's suspense in its purest form, not danger. The possibility of danger held open just long enough to make you certain it's coming, then withdrawn just before it arrives. Hitchcock knew that the imagination, given sufficient stimulation, will torture itself far more effectively than anything he could depict directly. The rain, the sign, the turn Marian drives through the afternoon into the evening. The rain gets heavier. In a film that's scrupulously economical with its visual symbolism, Hitchcock rarely underlines, rarely italicizes. The rain functions as a kind of moral weather system. It gets worse the further she goes. The windshield wipers hammer back and forth. Visibility drops, and in the darkness and the downpour, Marian misses the turnoff to the main highway. She sees a sign for the Bates Motel. 12 cabins, 12 vacancies. She pulls in. This is the hinge of the entire film, the single moment where narrative fate locks into place. Marian is tired and wet and frightened, and she takes the first shelter she sees. There's nothing supernatural about it. No compulsion, no doom, no gothic predestination. She's just a woman who's been driving for hours in the rain and wants somewhere to sleep. The ordinariness of this choice is what makes it devastating. She didn't have to stop here. She could have kept going, but it's raining and she's tired and there's a light on. That's all. The entire machinery of what follows turns on something as simple and human as being tired and wet. Meeting Norman. The office is empty when Marian first enters. She rings the bell, and then Norman Bates comes down from the house, unhurried, slightly startled, smiling with that particular warmth of someone who doesn't get many visitors and genuinely appreciates the ones who come. Perkins plays this first arrival beautifully. Norman is delighted, not in a creepy way, in the way of someone who is lonely and suddenly isn't. He fumbles with the register. He gives her cabin 1, closest to the office, he says. Easy. And then, with the impulsive, anxious to please energy of someone trying too hard not to seem too eager, he invites her for sandwiches. She accepts. What follows? The parlor scene over sandwiches and milk, with Norman's taxidermied birds watching from every surface, is the dramatic center of the entire film, not the shower scene, this scene, because this is where Psycho reveals what it's actually about. They talk. Two lonely people, each running from something, finding a moment of unexpected connection in a back room stuffed with dead things. Norman talks about his mother, about how she's not well, about how she needs him, about how he can't leave because she'd have nowhere to go. There's a line he delivers that stops the room every time. A boy's best friend is his mother. He says it with complete sincerity, no irony, no self-awareness. He means it. And Marian, who is also trapped by an attachment she can't quite escape, to Sam, to the money she's stolen, to the life she was trying to escape when she took that cash, hears him and recognizes something. She says gently that maybe he should get away from here, that maybe everyone has their private traps, that she got into hers of her own free will. This is the thematic heart of the film said plainly. We build our own traps. Marian chose to steal the money. Norman chose to let his mother consume him, or at least has told himself it was a choice. Both of them are sitting in a room full of dead, frozen birds, having a conversation about freedom, and neither of them recognizes the cage they're inside. Marian decides to go back. After dinner, Marian returns to her cabin, and something shifts. She sits at the desk. She does some arithmetic on a notepad, working out how much of the 40,000 she spent, how much remains, what it would look like to return it. She tears up the notepad and flushes the pieces. She seems to have made a decision. She's going to go back to Phoenix. She's going to return the money. This is crucial. Marian's arc, in the 45 minutes she's given, moves from dissatisfaction to transgression to something approaching grace. She's not redeemed in any completed narrative sense. The film doesn't give her time for that. But in this moment, before her shower, she is a person who has thought it through and chosen the harder, better path. Hitchcock shoots her here with a kind of quiet tenderness. The light is softer. She's calm. She smiles slightly. She's made her peace with something. Then she steps into the bathroom. She adjusts the shower. She undresses. She steps behind the curtain and the water runs and she lets it wash over her with something close to relief. And that's when the door opens. What we were set up to believe. Here's the structural genius of the Marion Crane section, stated plainly. Hitchcock has set up, in 45 minutes of screen time, a perfectly functional crime thriller. A woman steals money. She goes on the run. She has close calls. She meets a strange young man. She decides to turn herself in. We've been waiting this whole time for the inevitable confrontation with law enforcement. The catching up of consequences, the moment the theft is discovered, the reckoning Marian has been dreading since she walked out of that office with that envelope. That's the movie we think we are watching. The movie where the resolution is about the money, where the dramatic tension resolves around whether Marian will be caught, or whether she'll confess, or whether Sam will stand by her, where the trooper with the mirrored glasses eventually comes back, where the private detective Arbogast, hired by the real estate office to find the money, closes in. The shower scene doesn't just kill Marion Crane, it kills that movie. It kills every expectation you've built, every narrative prediction you've been holding, every emotional investment you've made in a particular kind of resolution. None of it is coming. That movie is gone. What replaces it is something Hitchcock and Stefano and Bloch had been hiding just off screen the entire time. Something that was always there, patient in the dark behind the motel, waiting for exactly this moment to announce itself. And it announces itself with strings. Before we talk about what happens in that bathroom, we need to sit with what Norman does immediately after. What comes after? The specific texture of Norman Bates in the minutes surrounding Marion's death, because that texture is where Anthony Perkins does some of the most precise, unsettling work in the entire picture. After Marion goes to her cabin, Norman goes back to the office. He moves the guest register. And this is the moment that first tips something dark into the air. He slides back a painting on the wall of the office to reveal a peephole. He looks through it. He watches Marion undress. Hitchcock shoots Norman at the peephole with that characteristic visual economy. One eye, the slight tension in the jaw. He goes back into the house. This single scene of voyeurism does enormous work. First, it establishes Norman as a sexual being with desires he can't openly acknowledge, desires that his mother's voice in his head would denounce as filthy, dirty, depraved. Second, it makes us complicit. We've watched him watch her. We've looked through his eye. The architecture of the attack. The shower sequence runs for approximately 3 minutes of screen time. It was shot over 7 days. There are, depending on how you count, somewhere between 70 and 78 distinct camera setups. The result is a sequence of pure editing rhythm, not a scene in any conventional dramatic sense, but a piece of montage that functions almost like music. This bathroom is relentlessly bright, there's nowhere to hide. Then a shape behind the curtain. Indistinct at first, you might think it's a trick of light, a fold in the fabric, then more distinct, then unmistakably human. A hand reaches for the curtain, it pulls it back. The figure is in silhouette, backlit, features completely obscured. The result is a sound world of unusual austerity, all scrape and snap and shudder, music that lives entirely in the physical properties of bowed strings pushed to their extremes. The shower scene cue is called the murder in the score, and it consists of that famous sustained screech, strings bowed very near the bridge, which produces a harsh, almost metallic tone that sits right at the threshold between music and noise. It doesn't resolve, it doesn't have a melody you can follow. It simply attacks, sustains, and attacks again in jagged rhythmic bursts that sink to the cutting so precisely that it becomes impossible to separate the visual violence from the sonic violence. Herman initially scored the shower scene with no music at all. He disagreed with Hitchcock's instinct to leave it silent. He composed the cue anyway, presented it to Hitchcock without telling him he'd done it, and Hitchcock, who had been insistent that silence would be more disturbing, heard it once and completely reversed himself. He reportedly told Herman that the music was worth its weight in gold and gave him a bonus. What Herman understood and what Hitchcock quickly recognized was that silence in that sequence would have been too real. Silence would have placed the scene in the register of documentary, the bare, clinical horror of an actual violent crime. The strings push it into something else. They aestheticize it. There is no explicit depiction of penetration, of wounding, of biological damage. What we get instead is the violent suggestion of all those things, the proximity of blade to skin, the expression on Marion's face, the blood that runs in dark rivers down the white tiles and spirals down the drain. Hitchcock was acutely aware of the production code restrictions still nominally in place, and he was also genuinely uninterested in gore as a mechanism of horror. What he wanted and achieved was psychological violence rather than physical violence. The cutting in both senses, the editing and the depicted action, creates the experience of witnessing something terrible without depicting it in literal terms. This is why the sequence has held up across 60 plus years while graphic violence in other films has dated badly. Gore becomes familiar. Still perfectly intact, Hitchcock holds on it just long enough. Then Norman's voice comes from outside. Mother! Oh God, mother! Blood! Blood! And the film pivots. Norman cleans up. What comes next is as important as the shower sequence itself. And it's the part of Psycho that gets least discussed in the cultural conversation around the film. Norman comes into the cabin. He gathers her belongings, her clothes, her bag, and puts them in the trunk of her car. He does this methodically, thoroughly, with the quiet competence of someone who has done this before or who has thought about doing it before, with enough specificity that the process comes naturally. The newspaper with the money is on the nightstand. He just wants everything to disappear. Hitchcock shoots this cleanup with no music. Just the sounds of Norman's work, water running, materials dragging across tile, the soft thud of the car trunk closing. The silence makes it horrible in a completely different register than the strings and cutting of the murder. This is patient domestic horror, the mundane labor of concealment. Then the car continues to sink. Slowly, completely, silently below the surface. Norman's face relaxes, and you realize, to your horror, that you have just spent the last 5 minutes hoping the car would sink, hoping the evidence would disappear, hoping Norman would succeed. Hitchcock has made you root for the killer. The structural shift, with Marian gone and her car at the bottom of a swamp. Psycho does something that no Hollywood film had done before and very few have done since. It fundamentally changes genre midstream. The film that opened was a crime drama, a woman on the run, a stolen fortune, the moral weight of transgression. The film that continues after Marian's death is something closer to a mystery, structured around a set of investigative figures, trying to find out what happened to her. Sam Loomis, who knows only that Marian was supposed to come to him. Leigh Crane, Marian's sister, desperate and frightened. And Milton Arbogast, a private detective hired by the real estate office to recover the money. Martin Balsam plays him as a professional, slightly weary, slightly cynical, the kind of man who has found missing people before and knows the systematic patience the work requires. He interviews Norman, and the interview is a masterclass in the dynamics of interrogation. Norman squirms. He lies badly. He contradicts himself. Arbogast notices all of this with the quiet attentiveness of a man doing mental arithmetic while appearing to make conversation. He calls Sam and Leigh. He's found something, he says. He's going back to the motel. He's going to try to talk to the mother. He goes back to the motel. He goes to the house. He opens the front door. He starts up the stairs. And then the door at the top of the stairs opens. And a figure rushes out. And Arbogast falls backward down the staircase. And the figure follows him to the floor. And the knife goes up and down, and he's gone. The second death happens faster than the first. And still, you don't know the full truth of what Norman Bates is. After Arbogast disappears, after his phone call to Sam and Leigh goes silent, and he simply stops answering, the film makes another of its structural adjustments. The investigation doesn't end, it transfers. Sam Loomis and Leigh Crane are, as protagonists go, deliberately functional. They are the investigators. They exist to move toward the truth, and their relative emotional flatness is protective for them and for us. John Gavin plays Sam with the kind of earnest straightness that works precisely because it doesn't compete with anything else on screen. Vera Miles as Leigh is sharper, more compelling. There's a focused urgency in how she carries herself, a grief that's been transformed into forward motion rather than expressed as feeling. She doesn't cry for Marian, she looks for her. The distinction tells you everything about Leigh Crane. They go to the local sheriff. Wrong in a more disturbing way. Reality and Norman's reality have diverged so completely that the sheriff's accurate statement and Norman's actual situation can both be true simultaneously, somehow, in the logic of this film. That's the moment where Psycho tips from thriller into something approaching psychological horror. Because now you're not just afraid of what Norman might do, you're afraid of what Norman is. What kind of mind produces the thing the sheriff is unknowingly describing? The motel at night. Sam goes to the motel as a decoy, keeping Norman occupied and distracted while Leigh slips away to search the property. This section of the film moves with a taut, purposeful energy that contrasts sharply with the dreamlike drift of Marian's journey. The investigation sequences have the feel of a countdown, each moment bringing the revelation closer, while the tension of what that revelation might be keeps ratcheting upward. Norman receives Sam with visible discomfort. He knows on some level that something is wrong with his visit. Sam makes conversation, asks about the motel, about business, about Norman's life, and watch how Perkins plays these scenes. Norman is agitated in a new way here, not the flustered nervousness of a shy young man, but something more defensive, more watchful. He's protecting something. His glances toward the house are different now, quicker, more careful. Meanwhile, Lila moves through the property. The production design, which we'll examine in depth in the craft sections of this script, is doing remarkable work throughout the film, but in the house, it becomes something more than a set. It becomes a psychological portrait. The Victorian interior is dark and cluttered, a house that belongs to a different era, preserved not with the care of someone who loves antiques, but with the static preservation of someone who can't allow anything to change. Heavy drapes, dark wood, a profusion of ornamental objects, figurines, framed pictures, the kind of interior that has accumulated rather than been assembled, each object a monument to its moment of acquisition, nothing ever removed, nothing ever updated. This is, of course, Mother's house. Norman doesn't live here by his own aesthetic choices. He lives here because this is what Mother left, and nothing has changed since she died, because nothing can change, because change would require acknowledging that she's gone. Leela moves through the downstairs rooms with growing unease. Then she goes upstairs. Mother's bedroom is the film's most loaded space. And in the vanity mirror, she sees her own reflection, startled and startles herself. It's a perfectly executed jump moment, not a monster, just her own face, and it tells you something about the film's entire strategy. The horror is reflexive. We scare ourselves, we project. The monster that lurks in Norman's house is partly a creature of the imagination, assembled from absence and suggestion, and the gap between what should be there and what is. Then she hears something from downstairs, goes back down. The house seems empty. She goes outside. She walks toward the fruit cellar. The fruit cellar door is heavy. She's been preserved, mummified, in the rough, horrified manner of someone who couldn't bear to let go, and dressed and positioned in this chair, and here she is, Mrs. Bates, the mother who was supposedly buried in the local cemetery. Leela screams, grabs the pull cord, the bare bulb swings, and in the swinging light, the dead woman's face rotates through shadow and brightness, appearing in the most primal animal brain register of human terror to move, to turn, to look. And then Norman comes through the door. He's wearing a dress, a wig, the clothes from Mother's closet. His face is powdered, his jaw set in an expression that is simultaneously recognizable as Norman and completely, terrifyingly different, something else looking out through Norman's familiar features. He has a knife raised. Sam bursts in from behind, having realized what's happening. He wrestles Norman down, and the fight is brief and ferocious. Norman has a strength that surprises everyone, including apparently himself, that wiry physical desperation of someone who genuinely believes, in this moment, that they are fighting as their mother. Sam gets the knife away. Norman collapses, weeping. It's over. The psychiatrist scene. In the police station, afterward, a psychiatrist named Dr. Fred Richman explains what Norman Bates is. This scene is, in the context of modern film, somewhat contentious. Built an alternate personality using her voice, her mannerisms, her worldview, eventually going so far as to dress as her, inhabit her, be her, when the Norman identity couldn't tolerate what the mother identity demanded. The alternate personality, Richman explains, has become dominant. It began emerging more frequently as the years passed. There's almost no Norman left. Contemporary viewers and critics sometimes push back on this scene, argue that it's too neat, that it over-explains, that the mystery Hitchcock has so carefully maintained doesn't need a clinical summary, and there's truth in that objection. The explanation is necessarily a reduction. It takes something genuinely strange and dark and uncategorizable and flattens it into a diagnosis. But Hitchcock and Stefano made a deliberate choice to include it. The audience of 1960 had never encountered anything quite like Norman Bates before. The concept of dissociative identity, of a personality so fractured it could commit murder in one identity and genuinely believe itself innocent in another, was not part of popular cultural vocabulary. Without Richmond's explanation, a significant portion of the audience would have left the theater simply confused rather than disturbed. And there's another function the scene serves that's easy to miss. It makes Norman pitiable. Even at this late stage, even knowing what he's done, Richmond's clinical account restores the sympathy Perkins carefully constructed through the entire film. Norman didn't choose this. The dead woman and the living man sharing the same face for one impossible instant. Then it's gone. Just Norman again, smiling at the floor. A title card, Sheriff Chambers, will return within 24 hours. The procedural world asserting itself, the machinery of law grinding forward. What he didn't explain, couldn't explain, is what it means, what it says about the capacity of the human mind to construct realities impermeable to outside truth, what it says about the stories we tell ourselves to survive, and the cost of those stories, and the damage they do. Norman Bates is at peace. That's the most disturbing thing Psycho ever shows you. In Rear Window, it's Jeff's immobile, binocular gaze. In Vertigo, it's Scotty's obsessive, reconstructive desire. In Psycho, it's more radical. The perspective keeps shifting, and each shift makes the audience complicit in something more disturbing than the last. You look through Norman's peephole with him. You watch the cleanup with the same objective remove as the camera to make you an accessory. John L. Russell and the television aesthetic director of photography. John L. Russell shot Psycho with the efficiency and visual instincts of a television veteran, and the film's look reflects that in ways that are more deliberate than they might initially appear. In practice, Russell brought something to the film that a more theatrical minded cinematographer might not have. His lighting is efficient, high contrast, deep blacks, a tendency towards simple, stark setups rather than elaborate theatrical illumination. The Bates Motel has a flat, harsh quality that feels slightly wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. It looks almost too real, too mundane, lit with the indifferent brightness of a documentary rather than the sculpted chiaroscuro of a studio production. The house is different. There, Russell allows the shadows to pool and deepen to create the kind of gothic architecture of light that the story requires. The contrast between the flat, exposed motel and the dramatic, shadow carved house reinforces the film's psychological geography. The motel is where Norman performs normalcy. The house is where the truth lives. You start to feel studied rather than just observed. The camera is looking at Norman the way Norman looks at things through his peephole, with an intensity that goes just slightly past normal. The 50mm lens and the reality effect. The decision to shoot almost entirely on 50mm lenses is one that repays careful thought. In optical terms, a 50mm lens on a 35mm camera produces roughly the same angle of view as the human eye, around 47 degrees diagonal. It doesn't compress space the way a telephoto lens does, and it doesn't distort or expand it the way a wide angle does. It just shows you what's there. Most Hollywood films of the period used a wider range of focal lengths, wide lenses to create dramatic environments, longer lenses to isolate faces in close-up, standard lenses for conversational scenes. The shifting of focal lengths creates a kind of visual vocabulary. Wide means this is important in terms of place and space. Long means this is about this person, this expression, this specific human moment. Audiences were trained to read these shifts even without consciously registering them. Psycho's reliance on the 50mm collapses that glamour. Every shot looks roughly the same in terms of spatial representation. Close-ups and wide shots share the same optical quality. The result is a film where location and person feel equally weighted, where the bathroom and Marian's face and the drain and the swamp all exist in the same visual register. Nothing is elevated above anything else by optical choice. Everything is equally, impartially real. This matters because it denies the audience the comfort of visual hierarchy. In a conventionally shot thriller, the camera's focal choices tell you what to care about, where to focus your emotional attention. Psycho's flat visual field refuses to make those decisions for you. You have to find your own bearing in every shot, which keeps you slightly off balance throughout, which is, of course, exactly where Hitchcock wants you. The Bates Motel, a space that breathes the physical design of the Bates Motel, is worth lingering over because it operates on several levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's a realistic representation of a certain type of mid century American roadside motel, the kind that existed in the thousands along the new interstate highway system, catering to travelers moving between cities. Art director Joseph Hurley clearly did research. The cabin proportions are right. The office is the right size for a one person operation. The general aesthetic of modest, functional accommodation is entirely plausible. But look at how the motel sits in relation to its surroundings. It's slightly off the main highway. The road realignment that Norman mentions has left it bypassed, away from the traffic that once fed it. It sits in a low, contained space, visible from the road but not quite connected to it, and behind it, elevated on a ridge, the house watches. The spatial relationship between motel and house is almost musical in its consistency. Set decorator George Milo filled the motel office with the specific detritus of Norman's inner life. The taxidermied birds everywhere, not just the owl and the crow that Marian notices during their conversation, but birds on every surface, birds in every corner. Norman describes his hobby as peaceful, calming, but look at what taxidermy actually is. It's the preservation of dead things in the poses and postures of life. It's making death look like living. That's precisely what Norman is doing with his mother and has been doing for years. The birds are a self portrait. Norman doesn't know that, but you do. The high gables, the narrow windows, the imposing verticality, these are visual codes for a certain kind of haunted past, a certain kind of oppressive inheritance. The genre vocabulary of the Gothic novel lives in buildings like this one: Poe's House of Usher, Bronte's Thornfield Hall, Du Maurier's Manderley, houses where the past refuses to die, where dead women continue to exert their will on the living, where architecture itself becomes a form of imprisonment. Hitchcock knew his audience would read these codes instinctively. He didn't need to explain what the house meant, he just needed to put it there, on that ridge, and let it do its work. Inside, the house is a museum of Norman's arrested development. Every object belongs to before mother's death, before whatever psychological catastrophe produced the Norman Bates we meet. Nothing has been replaced or updated or chosen by Norman himself. He lives entirely inside the aesthetic and material world of his mother's lifetime. This isn't nostalgia. It's a refusal to acknowledge that time has moved. The decision to position mother's bedroom as a fully lived in space, with a recent impression in the pillow, with clothes being worn regularly, is a masterpiece of environmental storytelling. Before anyone says a word about what Norman has done, the room tells you, not explicitly, not in terms anyone could articulate without additional information, but in the visceral, undeniable language of a space that is both right and wrong simultaneously. Someone lives here, and whoever it is shouldn't. Shadow and light, the film's visual grammar. If there's a single visual motif that runs through Psycho more consistently than any other, it's the opposition of light and shadow, not used symbolically in the heavy handed way of lesser films, but structurally, architecturally, as a way of organizing information. Scenes shot in daylight or bright artificial light are scenes of performance, of surfaces, of the face people show the world. The real estate office, where Marian goes through the motions of her ordinary life. The hotel room, where she and Sam conduct their afternoon affair. The motel office, where Norman deploys his shy, helpful persona for new arrivals. Scenes shot in deep shadow, in partial darkness, in the specific half light of inadequate illumination. Those are where the truth lives. The parlor conversation moves into shadow as Norman's mask slips the tiniest fraction. The house interior, which never gets enough light. The fruit cellar with its single swinging bulb. The grey, diffuse light she moves through is the visual equivalent of moral limbo. She is neither in the clean brightness of her performed normality nor in the darkness of what she is about to encounter. She is in between. Hitchcock uses light as a map of psychological state and does it with enough subtlety that you feel it without intellectualizing it. The money, Marian's body, all of her possessions, the entire 45-minute investment of the film's first act, all of it goes into this unremarkable hole in the ground and disappears, not into dramatic darkness, not into some gothic abyss, into a muddy pool surrounded by weeds on a cloudy afternoon. He told Herman he thought the film might work better in silence, that the images were disturbing enough on their own terms, that music might soften the impact by aestheticizing it, might give the audience an emotional cue to follow rather than forcing them to generate their own responses. He was wrong. And Herman knew he was wrong before Hitchcock did. The absence of musical response signals to the audience's nervous system that what they are watching is being presented without interpretation, which can read as detachment rather than horror. Herman's strings don't tell you how to feel, they bypass feeling entirely and go straight to the nervous system. The standard orchestral palette for a Hollywood thriller of the period was full orchestra, brass for menace, woodwinds for ambiguity, strings for emotion, percussion for impact. Bernard Herrmann had used full orchestra to extraordinary effect throughout his career, most recently in his scores for Hitchcock's own Vertigo and North by Northwest. The Vertigo score in particular, with its lush romantic harmonies and spiraling orchestral textures, is among the most emotionally complex film scores ever written. Psycho goes in the exact opposite direction. By stripping the orchestra down to strings only, Herman eliminates warmth. Brass instruments, particularly French horns, have an inherent roundness and fullness that the human ear associates with reassurance, with heroic narrative, with emotional resolution. Woodwinds carry an intimacy, a breath quality that reads as human. Percussion grounds the music in physical reality. Without any of these, Herman's score floats in a strange, texturally uniform space. The prelude and what it announces. The score's opening cue, played over Saul Bass's famous title sequence, establishes the film's entire musical language in under 2 minutes. Bass's titles are a study in controlled anxiety. Horizontal black lines that split and reassemble into Janet Leigh's name, Anthony Perkins' name, the film's title, all in sharp geometric motion, never quite settling, always in the process of fracturing or reforming. The visual language is about fragmentation, about things that appear whole but are constituted of parts that don't fully cohere. By the time the cue ends and the camera begins its drift across the Phoenix skyline, your nervous system is already primed. You've been put into a state of low-level alert before you've seen a single character or heard a single word of dialogue. The score has done its psychological groundwork, and it did it by refusing to give you a melody you could lean into or a rhythm you could comfortably predict. Herman doesn't write hummable music. He writes inhabitable states. The shower scene cue, a technical breakdown. The murder cue runs for approximately 2 minutes and is structured in 3 distinct phases that map precisely onto the editing rhythm of the sequence. The first phase is the attack, the initial intrusion, the curtain pulled back, the first knife blow. Here, Herman uses his full string complement in the highest, harshest register available, violins and violas bowing with maximum pressure near the bridge, producing that characteristic metallic shriek. The rhythm is irregular, short burst, no consistent pulse, the musical equivalent of something striking at random intervals. You can't predict when the next blow will land musically or visually. Your nervous system can't pre-prepare. The second phase is the sustained assault as the cutting accelerates and Marian fights back weakly. The strings move into a series of rapid upward slides, each one a kind of sonic lunge, each followed by a hard downward cut back to the starting pitch. Tomasini had been Hitchcock's regular editor since Rear Window in 1954. By Psycho, they had a working relationship of unusual intimacy. Tomasini knew Hitchcock's visual instincts well enough to make choices that extended rather than merely implemented the director's intentions. Hitchcock shot Psycho with the final cut almost entirely predetermined. He famously said he didn't need to go to the editing room because the film was edited in the camera, each shot sized to fit exactly one position in the finished sequence. This is somewhat exaggerated, as Hitchcock's claims about his own process sometimes were, but it reflects a genuine truth about how precisely he designed his coverage. Tomasini's particular contribution in Psycho is rhythm. Not just in the shower sequence, throughout the film, the cutting has a temporal intelligence that's inseparable from how the film produces anxiety and release. Consider the parlor scene. In a conventional film, a two-person conversation of this duration and intimacy would be edited in relatively standard short reverse shot patterns. Close-up of speaker, close-up of listener, occasional two-shot for spatial context. Tomasini and Hitchcock do something more interesting. The cuts in the parlor scene are slightly off, not dramatically wrong, but just a beat later or earlier than you'd expect. The rhythm keeps you from settling into the comfortable visual pattern of conventional conversation editing. You're always fractionally surprised by when the cut comes. This is extraordinarily difficult to pull off without calling attention to itself. cut too early or too late, and the audience notices the editing, which is death to immersion. The margin of effective displacement is tiny, a few frames on either side of the conventional cut point. Tomasini operates in that margin with remarkable precision. The sequence contains somewhere between 70 and 78 cuts. The exact count varies depending on how certain transitional frames are classified. It runs approximately 3 minutes. That works out to roughly one cut every 2 to 3 seconds, which is rapid by the standards of the period but not unprecedented in action sequences. What makes the shower scene extraordinary isn't just the cutting rate, it's the specific nature of what's being cut together. Almost no two consecutive shots share spatial orientation. The camera position, angle, and distance change with virtually every cut. You go from a low angle on the shower head to a medium shot of Marian's face, to a close up of her torso, to a wide shot of the figure, to a close up of the knife, to Marian's back, to Marian's face again. And with each cut, you're being repositioned in space. Your spatial relationship to the action keeps resetting, which prevents you from establishing the stable viewpoint you'd need to process what you're seeing in any analytical way. You can't get your bearings, and when you can't get your bearings, the brain does something interesting. It fills the gaps. It assembles the incomplete spatial information into a coherent whole, and in doing so, it takes ownership of the scene's violence. The violence you assemble in your mind from Tomasini's fractured editing is your own construction, which makes it more disturbing than anything Hitchcock could have depicted directly. You made this, you put it together, the film gave you the pieces, and your mind built the murder. Sound design, the layer. Nobody hears. The sound design in Psycho operates in parallel with Herman's score, doing a different kind of work that only becomes apparent when you watch the film with headphones or in a properly calibrated theatrical environment. Hitchcock's sound team, working with sound editor William Russell, approached the film with unusual care for the specific acoustic qualities of each space. The motel office has a particular indoor silence, the absorbed, slightly deadened quiet of a small room with low ceilings. The cabins have a different acoustic signature, slightly more resonant, the sound of shower water more present and enveloping. The house interior has a different quality again, older, slightly reverberant, the sound behavior of a space with high ceilings and hard surfaces. These distinctions are below the level of conscious notice for most viewers. Hitchcock was reportedly dissatisfied with multiple versions before finding the sound quality he wanted. The result is a shower sound that is somehow both ordinary and slightly too present, slightly too encompassing. It fills the soundtrack with a white noise quality that isolates Marian and the bathroom from the rest of the world. She's in a sealed space. When the curtain opens, it opens into that sealed space, and the intrusion sounds exactly as wrong as it looks. The knife sounds, per the most reliable accounts, were achieved by stabbing a cassava melon. It was this specific sound, neither too hard nor too soft, carrying just enough wetness to be organic without being explicitly biological, that Hitchcock spent considerable time finding and approving. It's heard clearly in the sequence despite the competing strings, a sound that the conscious mind quickly suppresses because acknowledging exactly what it sounds like is too uncomfortable to sit with. That Psycho sound design philosophy in a sentence make the audience hear things they immediately don't want to have heard. His poster work and title sequences for Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Anatomy of a Murder had established a visual language of fractured geometry and kinetic motion that was unlike anything in mainstream graphic design at the time. Bass understood that the title sequence wasn't an introduction to a film. It was the film's first scene, its opening gambit, its initial move in the game. It was about to play with the audience. For Psycho, he designed a sequence of horizontal gray bars that move, split, shift, and reassemble across the frame. This is Norman Bates in abstract form, laid out for you before you've met him, in the language of lines and movement rather than narrative. Bates was designing the film's unconscious before the film story had a chance to establish it. And he did it in black and white, sharper than color, more aggressive, more architectural. The grey bars and white titles against black backgrounds feel almost violent in their precision. There's no warmth, no welcome. This title sequence does not want you comfortable, it wants you alert. He reprised the role three times, in Psycho 2 in 1983, Psycho 3 in 1986, which he also directed, and Psycho EV in 1990. He was always good in the role. But the cultural lock-in was total. The boyish, angular face, the nervous laugh, the hands that moved with that slightly wrong energy. These things belonged to Norman so completely that casting Perkins in anything else required the audience to consciously override their association. Most couldn't fully manage it. He knew this. In later interviews, he discussed it with the philosophical equanimity of someone who has made his peace with something he can't change, while the equanimity itself suggested the work that peace required, none of which diminishes the achievement. What Perkins does in Psycho is, considered on its own terms and without the cultural mythology around it, one of the most technically precise performances in American film. The key is the management of register. Perkins operates across three distinct modes throughout the film, and the transitions between them are so carefully calibrated that you barely register them as transitions. In the first mode, Norman as Norman, the helpful motel keeper receiving a guest, he is warm, slightly awkward, genuinely eager to please. The smile is real. The embarrassment when he talks about his hobby is real. The pleasure in Marian's company is real. There is nothing profound about it, nothing that signals this is a mask rather than a face. It's almost imperceptible. Almost. In the third mode, Norman fully occupied by the mother personality, Perkins stops being Norman. The physicality changes. He moves differently. But crucially, he never plays it as obvious. He never announces it with theatrical excess. Even in the film's final moments, in the holding cell, the shift is quiet, a gradual reorientation of expression rather than a sudden transformation. The discipline this requires is extraordinary. Every instinct of theatrical training would push an actor toward more in these moments, more clearly signaled, more dramatically readable. Perkins consistently does less, and the less he does, the more disturbing Norman becomes. Janet Leigh, 45 minutes of everything. In the context of the film's complete arc, Janet Leigh appears for less than half its runtime. She is dead before the midpoint. And yet her performance is so thoroughly the foundation of everything that follows, that without it, none of the rest works. What Leigh does is make Marian completely, fallibly human in the way that screen protagonists often aren't, not because they're deliberately glamorized, but because the requirements of classical narrative tend to idealize protagonists, to smooth their rough edges into types rather than people. Marion Crane has rough edges. She's making bad decisions. She's not graceful under pressure. The car trade, the nervous conversation with the dealer, the flinching at the sight of the trooper. These are the behaviors of a frightened person doing everything slightly wrong. She's not a competent criminal. She's not a victim in the clean, uncomplicated sense either. She's something murkier, a good person making a bad choice for understandable reasons, who discovers too late that the consequences of bad choices don't calibrate themselves to the quality of your intentions. Leigh plays this without judgment and without special pleading. She doesn't ask for your sympathy. Still worth knowing. Her death is devastating not because it's graphically rendered, but because of what Leigh has built in the preceding 45 minutes. The shower scene takes something from you. It takes Marian. And what it takes is Leigh's specific, irreplaceable construction of a person, not a type, not a symbol, but someone you'd been sitting with long enough to feel you knew. Vera Miles and the undervalued second half. In discussions of Psycho's performances, Vera Miles as Leila Crane tends to get overlooked in favor of Leigh and Perkins. This is understandable. She enters the film late and her role is largely functional within the mystery structure, but it undersells what she contributes. Leela is the film's moral center in its second half, and Miles plays her with a steady, unsentimental determination that grounds the investigation sequences in emotional reality. She is grieving, but her grief is channeled forward rather than expressed openly. There's an interesting specificity in how Miles handles Lila's relationship to Marian's absence. It's not the paralytic grief of shock, but the propulsive grief of someone whose love for their sister has been transformed into a refusal to let her disappearance go unexplained. The complex, terrible expression when she turns from the vanity mirror and realizes she's alone in a room that should be empty but doesn't feel it. It's quiet, careful, deeply felt work. The kind of performance that holds a film together without drawing attention to itself, which is in many ways the hardest kind to give. Psycho is a film about mothers. The most obvious thematic reading of Psycho, Norman's pathological attachment to his mother as the engine of everything that happens, is so foregrounded that it's easy to stop there, to say, this is a film about a disturbed man and his dead mother, and that's what it's about. But watch what surrounds Norman's mother fixation. Watch the other mother related textures in the film. Marian steals from a man buying his daughter a wedding gift, an act of paternal provision for a child's future happiness. The money she takes isn't just capital, it's a father's love materialized, and she takes it. Sam Loomis is in debt partly because of his father's funeral expenses. His father's death is financially strangling the future of his relationship with Marian. The dead father is the obstacle. Leela Crane is searching for her sister, a sibling bond that functions emotionally as a kind of mutual parenthood, each looking out for the other, the bond that drives the investigation. Norman's case is the extreme version, but it's on a continuum that includes everyone in the story, the double identity and its discontents. One of Psycho's most elegant structural features is its system of doublings, pairs of characters and situations that mirror and illuminate each other. Marion and Norman are the most obvious pair. Both are trapped by circumstances. They can't escape through conventional means. Both are performing versions of themselves that suppress what they actually want. Both are, in their different ways, running from something. Their parlor conversation works so well precisely because they recognize each other, not consciously, not articulately, but in the specific register of people who are living under similar internal pressures. Norman and Norman as mother are the film's central double, the split that the film builds toward revealing. But this doubling has a visual grammar running through the film before the reveal. Hitchcock shoots Norman in ways that subtly fragment him, tight framing that cuts off parts of his body, compositions that emphasize the space above his shoulder as though making room for someone else, the recurring image of Norman's face partially in shadow, partially in light. Then there's the doubling between Marian and Leela. Both are in their early 30s. Both are women navigating a world where their options are constrained by men. Sam's debt, Laurie's authority, the various male officials who treat their concerns with patient condescension. Both make independent decisions to move toward what they want rather than waiting for permission. Marian's decisive action is transgressive and ultimately fatal. Leela's decisive action, entering the house while Sam runs the decoy, is transgressive and ultimately revelatory. They are the same type of woman making the same kind of choice. The difference is which world they walk into. The real estate office where Marian works. The new highway systems that should have fed the Bates Motel but bypassed it instead. The used car lot with its friendly salesman. The reasonable motel room that's entirely innocuous, entirely normal until it's a crime scene. Hitchcock was a British man's vision of American nightmare, and that slight externality of perspective gave him something that a filmmaker inside the culture might have lacked, the ability to see the gap between what the culture said it was and what it actually was, the smiling surface and the dark water underneath. Norman Bates is what lives behind the cheerful normalcy of mid-century American mythology. Not imported evil, not foreign threat, something homegrown, something produced by ordinary life in ordinary places. A mother and a son in a farmhouse in the Midwest. The wholesome American unit taken to its pathological extreme. The Italian giallo tradition. The lurid, stylized thriller horror films that began emerging from directors like Dario Argento and Mario Bava drew explicitly on Psycho's visual glamour of violence and surveillance. Brian De Palma spent the better part of a decade in productive dialogue with Hitchcock's methods, most explicitly in Dress to Kill in 1980, which is essentially Psycho rethought through a later era's more explicit relationship with sexuality and violence. The slasher genre that exploded with Halloween in 1978 and Friday the 13th in 1980 is Psycho's direct descendant, though a descendant that inherited the surface mechanics without much of the psychological complexity. The formula of the vulnerable young woman, the isolated location, the methodical killer, the twist reveal, all of this traces directly back to what Hitchcock assembled in that low-budget, self-financed TV crew production in the winter of 1959. But to frame Psycho primarily as the progenitor of slasher cinema is to diminish it in the same way that framing Citizen Kane primarily as a technical showcase diminishes that film. The descendants don't capture what the original was doing. They borrowed the vocabulary without the grammar, the violence without the voyeurism. The initial reviews were mixed at best. Several major critics found the film distasteful, too explicitly violent for what they considered Hitchcock's usual elevated thriller mode, too interested in squalor for its own sake. Bosley Crowther at the New York Times was notably dismissive, calling it a blot on an honorable career and expressing distaste for what he saw as the film's wallowing in abnormality. Others were more measured but still uncertain, acknowledging the technical achievement while questioning the artistic purpose. The popular audience didn't care, they lined up around blocks. By the mid 1960s, the influence of Psycho on subsequent filmmaking was undeniable enough that reassessment became inevitable. The peephole scene, in particular, became a touchstone for discussions of how cinema structures looking and who bears the weight of being looked at. The male gaze and its complications, Mulvey's framework, applied to Psycho, produces genuinely interesting results and also some complications that the film itself seems to anticipate. The argument simplified classical Hollywood cinema structures its visual economy around a male subject who looks and female objects who are looked at. The camera aligns itself with male desire, making the female body a spectacle for the audience's consumption. Psycho appears on one level. To exemplify this, Marian is photographed in her bra and slip in the film's opening minutes. She's washed through the peephole and she's killed in the shower, her vulnerability and her body both on extended display. But here's the complication. Hitchcock also makes you look through the peephole with Norman. He makes you complicit in the voyeurism in a way that doesn't allow comfortable identification with the male gaze so much as implication in it. You're not watching Norman watch Marion from a position of detached superiority. You're watching with him. And the film is completely aware of this and completely uninterested in letting you off the hook. Furthermore, Marian is not purely an object in the film's visual economy. She has 45 minutes of subjectivity, interior states, private decisions, moral growth that the film tracks with genuine care. The camera that watches her through the peephole is Norman's camera. The camera that sat with her on the bed while she made her calculations, that tracked the small movements of her face as she came to her decision. That camera cared about her. The film contains both registers simultaneously, and the tension between them is part of what makes it so uncomfortable to sit inside. It doesn't let you take a clean position. It makes you implicated in something you'd prefer to observe from a distance. Which is, one more time, the Hitchcock method in summary. Norman Bates and the cultural mythology of the killer. Norman Bates arrived before the cultural framework that would eventually be built around figures like him. Norman is sympathetic. Norman is a victim. Norman is a perpetrator. All of these things are true. All of them are true at the same time. This refusal of simplification is what keeps Norman Bates alive as a character across more than 60 years. He doesn't resolve into a type. He can't be summarized by a diagnosis or a category. The psychiatrist's explanation in the final section of the film tries to categorize him, and it partially succeeds, and what's left over, what sits outside the category, is what keeps you awake afterward. Anthony Perkins understood this about the character. In a 1982 interview, discussing the role he'd be reprising the following year, he said something that cuts to the heart of it. Norman Bates wasn't crazy in the way crazy people are crazy in movies. He was crazy the way regular people are, only more so. Let's go back to that holding cell one more time, because the more you sit with it, the more it yields. Norman is wrapped in a blanket. He won't hurt a fly, the mother voice says. And the camera holds on his face as that almost smile forms, as his eyes go to some place the camera can't follow, something that has found, in the annihilation of Norman's self, a kind of peace. This is genuinely frightening in a way that transcends the film's genre category. Horror films end with the monster destroyed, the evil contained, the world restored. Psycho ends with the monster comfortable, content, unthreatened by consequence because he is no longer there to experience consequence. Just an almost smile, just the quiet, terrible peace of a mind that has finally, completely, irrevocably become what it always was. Why Psycho endures. Films about disturbing psychology are common. Films that formally disturb the psychology of the audience are much rarer. Psycho is the latter kind. It's not enough to say the film is brilliantly made, though it is. It's not enough to say it's historically significant, though it is that too, in ways that ripple through 65 years of subsequent cinema. What makes Psycho genuinely, durably important is that it changed what cinema was capable of in terms of its relationship to the audience. That the desire to be genuinely shocked, not titillated, not safely scared, but actually disoriented, actually violated in some small, contained way, was real and commercially viable and artistically productive. Every horror film that came after it owes it something. Every thriller that kills its protagonist early owes it something. Every film that deploys unreliable structure, that withholds information strategically, that makes the audience complicit in the film's violence rather than comfortable spectators of it, all of them are working in the space Psycho opened. But none of them, not Halloween, not Silence of the Lambs, not Get Out, not any of the brilliant, genuinely disturbing films that have populated the genre in the decades since, has quite replicated what Psycho does at its core. Because what it does at its core isn't really a technique, it's a disposition toward the audience, a refusal to be kind, a refusal to give you the comfort of the story you expected, a willingness to sit you in a theater, take you somewhere you thought you recognized, and show you that you are somewhere entirely different all along. Alfred Hitchcock made 52 films. Psycho is the one that changed cinema. And 65 years later, with the shower curtain and the strings and Norman's face in the dark burned into the cultural memory of everyone who's ever been to the movies, it still does.